My name is David Chen. If you're listening to this, it means I'm probably dead. Or worse. I found this old recorder in what's left of my grandfather's cabin, and I need to tell someone what happened here. What's still happening here? 3 weeks ago, 4 of us came to Blackwood Forest for what was supposed to be a simple hunting trip. Me, Marcus, Thomas, and Jonas. We'd been friends since college, and this was our annual getaway. Just guys being guys, you know. Drinking beer, telling lies about the fish that got away, complaining about our wives and jobs. I keep thinking about how normal everything seemed that first morning. Marcus was making jokes about city boys trying to survive in the wilderness. Thomas was obsessing over his new rifle scope. Jonas was already planning what we'd do with the deer meat. We were so fucking naive, but I'm getting ahead of myself. See, this forest, this place has a history. The locals in town, they tried to warn us, but we didn't listen. Old Mrs. Henderson at the gas station, she grabbed my arm when I mentioned where we were heading. Her fingers were like ice, and she whispered, "Those woods take more than they give back." I laughed it off. Thought she was just another superstitious old woman trying to scare the city folk. I wish I'd listened to her. God, I wish I'd listened. The drive up to the cabin took longer than expected. The old logging road was barely visible, overgrown with thorny vines and fallen branches. Marcus was in the passenger seat, map spread across his lap, squinting at the faded markings. "Are you sure this is the right way?" he kept asking. "This doesn't look like it's been used in years." Thomas, who was driving, just gripped the steering wheel tighter. My grandfather's instructions were pretty clear. Follow the old logging road until you see the stone marker, then turn left at the dead oak tree. Jonas was in the back with me, cleaning his rifle for the 3rd time that day. He was always meticulous about his equipment, but this seemed excessive, even for him. His hands were shaking slightly as he worked. "You nervous about something, Jonas?" I asked him. He looked up at me with this strange expression, like he wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. "I had the weirdest dream last night," he finally said. I dreamed we were all standing in a circle in the forest, but we weren't ourselves anymore. We were just empty, like hollowed-out tree trunks." Marcus turned around and laughed. "Jesus, Jonas, lay off the late-night horror movies, will you? You're gonna psych yourself out before we even get there." That's when we saw it. The stone marker Thomas had mentioned. It was old, probably Native American, covered in symbols that seemed to shift and move when you looked at them directly. The dead oak tree next to it was massive, its branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. But what really caught our attention were the newer carvings. Someone had been here recently, carving symbols into the bark of living trees, deep cuts that were still bleeding sap. Or what we hoped was sap. Probably just some kids messing around, Thomas said, but his voice had lost its confidence. We unloaded our gear in silence, each of us stealing glances at those strange markings. Looking back, I think we all knew something was wrong from that very first moment. But none of us wanted to be the first to say it. None of us wanted to be the coward who suggested we turn around and go home. The cabin was exactly as Thomas had described it from his childhood visits. A simple 2-room structure with a stone fireplace, wooden floors that creaked with every step, and windows that hadn't been properly cleaned in decades. But something felt different about it now. The air inside was thick and stale, like it had been holding its breath for years. We spent the afternoon setting up our gear and exploring the immediate area around the cabin. The forest seemed normal enough during daylight hours. Birds were singing, squirrels were chattering in the trees, insects buzzed around our heads. But there was something underneath all that normal forest noise, a kind of waiting silence. Marcus found more of those carved symbols on trees throughout the area. They formed a rough circle around the cabin, like a boundary marker or warning system. Each symbol was different, but they all had the same unsettling quality. They seemed to pulse with their own inner rhythm, like a heartbeat. Maybe it's some kind of Native American protection circle, Thomas suggested, running his fingers over one of the deeper carvings. You know, to keep evil spirits away. Jonas shook his head. Protection circles are supposed to keep things out. These symbols, I get the feeling they're designed to keep things in. That first evening, we cooked dinner over the fireplace and shared stories like we always did. But our conversation kept coming back to those symbols. We couldn't stop thinking about them, couldn't stop wondering who had carved them and why. I did some research before we came up here, Thomas admitted, staring into the fire. About this area, I mean. There have been incidents. Groups of hikers and hunters who came up here and never came back. The official reports always blamed it on getting lost, wild animal attacks, stuff like that. But the locals have other theories. What kind of theories? I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. They say something lives in these woods. Something old and hungry. They say it feeds on friendship, on the bonds between people. It separates groups, picks them off one by one, until only one person is left to tell the story. But the survivor is never quite the same afterward. They become recruiters, drawing new groups to the forest. Marcus broke the tension with a forced laugh. Well, that's a cheerful bedtime story. Thanks, Thomas. I'm sure we'll all sleep great tonight. But none of us were laughing. Not really. Because somewhere deep down, we all felt the truth in Thomas's words. We could feel something watching us from the darkness beyond the firelight. Something patient and ancient and very, very hungry. I don't think any of us slept well that first night. The cabin felt like it was breathing around us, expanding and contracting with each gust of wind. Every creak, every settling sound seemed magnified in the darkness, but it was the silence that really got to us. The complete and total absence of normal forest sounds. Around 2 a.m, Marcus sat up in his sleeping bag. "Do you guys hear that?" he whispered. We all listened intently. At first, there was nothing. Then, slowly, we began to make out a rhythmic tapping sound coming from somewhere outside the cabin, like someone knocking on wood with their knuckles. The tapping moved around the cabin in a slow circle. It would stop at each window for a few seconds, then move on to the next. When it reached the front door, it paused for a long time. We could hear slow, deliberate breathing on the other side of the wood. Jonas reached for his rifle, but Thomas grabbed his arm. "Don't," he whispered. "Whatever's out there, we don't want to provoke it." The breathing at the door got louder, more labored, like whatever was out there was struggling to contain itself. Then we heard a voice, soft and plaintive, almost childlike. "Please, please let me in. I'm cold and lost. I just need somewhere to rest." It was a woman's voice, but there was something wrong with it. Something artificial, like someone doing a bad impression of human speech. Marcus started to get up. Maybe someone really is in trouble out there. No, the word came out of my mouth before I could stop it. "That's not a person. Please, I know you're in there. I can see your fire through the window. I'm hurt and scared. Please help me." But as the voice continued pleading, it began to change. The pitch shifted, becoming deeper and more guttural. The words started to slur together until they were barely recognizable as human speech. Then suddenly it stopped. The breathing ceased, the voice fell silent, and the normal sounds of the forest gradually returned. Owls hooting, branches creaking, the distant sound of some small animal rustling through the underbrush. We sat there in our sleeping bags until dawn, weapons within easy reach, but nothing else happened. When the sun finally came up, we ventured outside to look for tracks or signs of our nocturnal visitor. We found footprints in the dirt around the cabin, but they weren't human prints. They were too long, too narrow, with what looked like claw marks at the tips, and they didn't form a normal walking pattern. Instead, they seemed to spiral around the cabin in a complex geometric design. "Probably just a bear walking on its hind legs," Thomas said, but his voice was shaky. "I've heard they can do that sometimes." Marcus knelt down next to one of the clearer prints and shook his head. "This is no bear, Thomas. Look at the spacing. Look at the claw patterns. This is something else entirely." The second day started normally enough. We made breakfast, planned our hunting route, and tried to shake off the uneasiness from the night before. The morning sun filtering through the forest canopy made everything seem less threatening. In daylight, our fears from the night before seemed almost foolish. We decided to split up to cover more ground. Marcus and Jonas would take the eastern trail toward the old creek bed, while Thomas and I would head west toward the ridge. We agreed to meet back at the cabin by 4 o'clock. "If anyone doesn't show up by sundown, the others come looking," Thomas said. It seemed like a reasonable precaution at the time. Thomas and I had been walking for about an hour when we found the first one. It was hanging from a tree branch about 20 feet off the ground, swaying gently in the breeze. At first, we thought it might be some kind of hunting decoy or scarecrow, but as we got closer, we realized what we were looking at. It was a deer, but it had been altered somehow. Its limbs had been twisted and bent into unnatural positions, arranged to form one of those symbols we'd been seeing carved into the trees. The same symbols that surrounded our cabin. The deer's eyes had been removed and replaced with smooth river stones. Its mouth had been sewn shut with what looked like sinew or vine, and despite the obvious trauma to the body, there was no blood, no sign of decay. The carcass looked fresh, like it had been placed there just hours before. "What kind of predator does this?" Thomas asked, his face pale. "No predator," I replied. "This was done by human hands, or something with human intelligence." Thomas tried to raise Marcus and Jonas on the walkie-talkie, but all he got was static and interference. We decided to head back toward the cabin and regroup, but the forest had changed somehow during our short absence. Paths that had been clear that morning were now blocked by fallen trees. Landmarks we'd used to navigate seemed to have moved or disappeared entirely. It was like the forest itself was shifting around us, rearranging itself to keep us lost. We wandered for hours, calling out to Marcus and Jonas, following what we thought were familiar trails, only to find ourselves back where we started. The sun was getting low, pinking the forest in long, ominous shadows. That's when we heard the screaming. It came from somewhere to our north, echoing through the trees with a raw, desperate quality that made our blood run cold. The scream was distinctly human, distinctly male, and filled with a terror so profound It seemed to physically assault our ears. "Marcus!" Thomas shouted, and we both started running toward the sound. But the screaming stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt like the forest was holding its breath. We ran for another 10 minutes, crashing through underbrush and leaping over fallen logs, but we never found the source of that horrible sound. When we finally stopped to catch our breath, we realized we were completely lost. The sun was setting. Darkness was creeping through the trees like a living thing, and we had no idea which direction would lead us back to the cabin. That's when we saw the light flickering through the trees ahead of us. A warm, welcoming glow that looked exactly like the lantern we'd left burning in the cabin window. The light led us back to the cabin, but something was wrong. The door was standing wide open, and our gear was scattered across the front porch like someone had torn through our belongings in a frenzy. The lantern in the window was still burning, but it cast strange dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of the flame. "Marcus? Jonas?" Thomas called out, but there was no answer. Inside the cabin, we found signs of a struggle. One of the sleeping bags had been shredded to pieces, its stuffing scattered across the floor like snow. Claw marks scored the wooden walls in long, parallel gouges. And written on the wall above the fireplace, in what looked like blood, was a message. "The forest remembers. The forest feeds. One must remain." Thomas stared at the message, his face white as a sheet. "This is Marcus's handwriting," he whispered. "But that's not possible. Marcus would never." A heavy impact against the cabin wall made us both jump. Then another, and another, like something large was throwing itself against the structure. But when we looked out the windows, we couldn't see anything in the gathering darkness. The impacts moved around the cabin in the same pattern as the footprints we'd found that morning. A slow, deliberate circuit that seemed designed to terrorize rather than actually break in. "We need to barricade the door," I said, and we began dragging furniture across the entrance. That's when we heard Marcus's voice calling from outside. "Thomas, David, thank God you're back. Something happened to Jonas. You need to come help me. He's hurt bad." Thomas started toward the door, but I grabbed his arm. "Wait," I said. "If Marcus is out there, why hasn't he come inside? Why is he just standing out there talking? Come on, guys. I know you can hear me. Jonas is bleeding. He fell into some kind of pit trap. I can't get him out by myself." We pressed our faces to the window, trying to see Marcus in the darkness. And we did see a figure standing at the edge of the tree line. It had the right height and build to be Marcus, but something about its posture was wrong. It stood too still, too rigid, like a mannequin propped up between the trees. "Marcus," Thomas called through the window. "If that's really you, tell us something only you would know." The figure turned toward our voice, and even in the darkness, we could see that its face was wrong. The features were blurred and indistinct, like a photograph that had been smudged while the ink was still wet. "Why are you asking me stupid questions? Just come outside and help me with Jonas. He's dying out here." But the voice was different now. Still recognizably Marcus's voice, but with an electronic quality, like it was being played through a broken speaker. Thomas grabbed the walkie-talkie and tried the emergency frequency. "Mayday, Mayday. This is Thomas Gregory. We're at the old Henderson cabin in Blackwood Forest. We have missing persons and need immediate assistance." Static filled the cabin, but underneath the white noise, we could hear other voices. Dozens of them, all talking at once in languages we didn't recognize. And then, clear as day, we heard Jonas's voice coming through the speaker. "The forest has many voices," he said, his tone flat and emotionless. "It speaks in the language of the lost and the forgotten. Soon you will join the chorus." We spent that second night huddled together in the center of the cabin, backs against each other, weapons ready. The thing pretending to be Marcus stayed out there until dawn, sometimes calling to us, sometimes just standing in silence. Occasionally, it would circle the cabin, always just at the edge of visibility. Around midnight, we started hearing Jonas's voice too. It came from a different direction, near the back of the cabin. "Thomas, David, you have to come see this. I found something incredible out here. I found where they all went." "Who, Jonas?" Thomas called back, though we both knew we shouldn't engage. "All the missing people. All the groups that came before us. They're not dead, Thomas. They're just changed, transformed. The forest made them into something better, something eternal." The voices of our friends continued throughout the night, sometimes pleading, sometimes threatening, sometimes just speaking in those strange, inhuman languages we'd heard on the radio. But we never saw them clearly. They stayed just beyond the reach of our flashlight beams, always at the periphery of vision. When dawn finally broke, the voices stopped and the forest returned its deceptive normalcy. We ventured outside to look for more evidence of what had happened to Marcus and Jonas. What we found defied all rational explanation. Their footprints led away from the cabin in two different directions, but after about 50 yards, each trail simply ended. Not like they'd climbed a tree or jumped to another surface. The prints just stopped existing, as if our friends had simply dissolved into the air. But we did find other things. Personal items scattered throughout the forest in seemingly random locations. Marcus's watch hanging from a branch 30 feet up. Jonas's wallet sitting on a stump with all the money still inside, but his ID and credit cards missing. Most disturbing of all, we found pieces of clothing that belonged to both of them. But the clothes weren't torn or bloody. They were neatly cut, as if someone had carefully removed them with scissors. Thomas picked up one of Marcus's shirts and held it up to the light. There were holes in the fabric, but they weren't random tears. They formed a pattern, another one of those strange symbols we'd been seeing throughout the forest. "Something's playing with us," I said. "It's not just hunting us. It's toying with us. Like a cat playing with mice before it kills them." Thomas nodded grimly. "We need to get out of here. Right now. Forget about finding Marcus and Jonas. We need to save ourselves." We packed only the essentials and started hiking toward what we hoped was the main road. But the forest had other plans. Every trail we followed led us in circles. Familiar landmarks appeared where they shouldn't be. The sun seemed to move in impossible directions across the sky, making navigation by compass useless. By afternoon, we were exhausted and completely disoriented. That's when we stumbled across the clearing. It was a perfect circle, maybe 50 feet in diameter, where nothing grew. The ground was bare dirt, packed hard as concrete. In the center of the clearing stood a single tree, unlike any I'd ever seen. It was massive, ancient beyond measure, with bark that looked more like scarred flesh than wood. Its branches twisted upward in spirals that hurt to look at directly. And carved into its trunk were hundreds, maybe thousands of those mysterious symbols, layered over each other in a chaotic tapestry of meaning we couldn't comprehend. As we approached the tree, we began to hear voices coming from inside its trunk. Muffled, distant voices speaking in dozens of different languages. Some sounded recent, like recordings made yesterday. Others had the hollow, echoing quality of very old audio. Thomas pressed his ear against the bark and went pale. "I can hear them," he whispered. "I can hear Marcus and Jonas in there. They're not alone." I listened too, and he was right. Mixed in with all the other voices were the familiar tones of our missing friends. They were speaking in that same flat, emotionless cadence we'd heard on the radio. "The forest welcomes all travelers," Marcus's voice said from somewhere deep inside the wood. "We have found peace here, purpose. We serve the ancient hunger now. Join us," Jonas added. "Let the forest feed on your bonds of friendship. Let it consume what makes you human. You will find such beautiful emptiness on the other side." The tree began to move, its branches swaying despite the complete absence of wind. The symbols carved into its bark started to glow with that same red light we'd seen the night before, and the trunk began to split open, revealing a hollow interior filled with swirling darkness. Inside that darkness, we could see shapes moving. Human shapes, but wrong somehow. Elongated and twisted, like shadows cast by firelight. And their eyes. God, their eyes were like holes punched through reality itself. Thomas grabbed my arm. "We need to run. Now." But as we turned to flee, we found our path blocked. The things that had once been Marcus and Jonas stood at the edge of the clearing, but they were no longer even pretending to be human. Their bodies had been stretched and distorted, limbs elongated to inhuman proportions. Their faces were blank, featureless, except for those terrible dark holes where their eyes should have been. And when they moved, it was with a fluid, boneless grace that made my skin crawl. "You cannot leave," the thing that had been Marcus said, its voice now a chorus of whispers. "The forest has chosen you. One of you will join us willingly, and the other will carry our message to the next group." "What message?" I demanded, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. The Marcus thing tilted its head to an impossible angle. "That friendship is a lie. That human connection is weakness. That isolation is the only truth. You will learn this lesson as we did." As they all did, behind us, the tree continued to open, its hollow interior revealing more and more of those twisted shadow shapes. I realized they were the remains of all the previous groups who had come to this forest. Decades, maybe centuries of victims, all transformed into servants of whatever ancient intelligence lived in that tree. Thomas raised his rifle and fired at the Marcus thing. The bullet passed right through its body without effect, but the creature recoiled as if in pain, or perhaps in amusement. "Physical force cannot harm us now," it said. "We are beyond such crude concerns, but your weapon has given us an idea. A fitting end to your story." Thomas's rifle began to change in his hands. The metal flowed like liquid, reforming itself into one of those symbol shapes. It was still recognizably a weapon, but now it was something else as well, something that belonged to the forest. "One of you will use this to end the other," the Jonas thing explained in its whispered chorus voice. "The survivor will be marked, changed, prepared for the next phase of service. This is how it has always been." "No," I said, dropping the transformed weapon. "We won't play your game." But even as the words left my mouth, I could feel something changing inside my head. A creeping influence that whispered of the futility of resistance, the inevitability of surrender. The forest was inside my thoughts now, showing me images of all the other groups who had faced this same choice. I saw them turn on each other with desperate savagery, friendship dissolving into paranoid violence as the ancient hunger fed on their bonds. Thomas was experiencing the same thing. I could see it in his eyes, the way he kept glancing between me and the weapon on the ground. "It's not real," I told him, fighting against the growing certainty that he was plotting against me. "It's just the forest messing with our heads." But the doubt was there now, planted and growing like a malignant seed. Every shared glance, every movement Thomas made seemed loaded with potential threat. The shadow creatures that had been our friends began to circle us, herding us like sheep. Their movements were hypnotic, almost dance-like, and I found my attention drawn to the patterns they wove around us. "Watch them carefully," the Marcus thing whispered. "See how they move in perfect harmony. This is what you could become. No more doubt, no more fear, no more loneliness. Just perfect unity with the forest's will." I don't know how long we stood there, paralyzed by indecision and growing mutual suspicion. Time seemed to stretch and compress around us like taffy. Minutes felt like hours, but also like seconds. Then Thomas broke. "I'm sorry, David," he said, lunging for the transformed rifle. "I'm so sorry, but I can't fight it anymore. The voices, they're so loud." I tackled him before he could reach the weapon, and we rolled across the hard-packed earth of the clearing. But Thomas was stronger than me, always had been, and the forest was giving him additional strength. He pinned me down and reached for the rifle again, but I managed to kick it away from both of us. It skittered across the clearing and came to rest against the base of the ancient tree. "You don't understand," Thomas gasped, tears streaming down his face. "If I don't do this, it'll be so much worse. The forest showed me what happens to the ones who resist. They become part of the tree, conscious but trapped forever. At least this way, one of us gets to leave. Nobody has to die, Thomas. We can find another way." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. The shadow creatures were closing in, and I could feel the forest's influence growing stronger with each passing moment. Soon, we'd both be too far gone to resist. That's when I made the decision that's haunted me ever since. I grabbed a sharp rock from the ground and brought it down on Thomas's head. Not hard enough to kill him, but hard enough to knock him unconscious. The shadow creatures stopped moving, as if they were surprised by this development. For a moment, the clearing was completely silent. Then the Marcus thing began to laugh, a sound like wind through dead leaves. "Interesting," it said. "You choose neither option. But the forest is patient. It has other uses for the unconscious one." Tendrils of root and vine began to emerge from the ground around Thomas's motionless form. They wrapped around his arms and legs, began to pull him toward the base of the great tree. "No!" I shouted, but I knew there was nothing I could do to stop it. Thomas disappeared into the hollow of the tree without waking up. I hope he never woke up. The alternative, the idea that he might be conscious somewhere in that darkness, aware but powerless, it's too horrible to contemplate. The shadow creatures began to fade as the sun reached its peak overhead. They didn't vanish completely, but became translucent, harder to focus on. "Your friend will serve the forest now," the Marcus thing said as it too began to lose cohesion. "His essence will feed the ancient hunger. And you had been chosen as herald, messenger, recruiter. I'll never help you," I spat. The creature that had once been my best friend smiled with a face that was mostly shadow now. "You already are helping us, David. Simply by surviving, you become part of the cycle. You will return to the world below, and the trauma of this experience will mark you. Others will see that mark, even if they don't understand what it means. And some of them will be curious enough to seek out these woods for themselves. The forest doesn't need willing servants, David. It only needs one survivor from each group to plant the seeds of the next harvest. As the sun reached its zenith, the shadow creatures faded completely, leaving me alone in the clearing with that ancient, terrible tree. I could still hear voices from inside its trunk, but they were quieter now, more distant. I found my way out of the forest that day, though I'm not sure how. One moment I was standing in that clearing, the next I was stumbling onto a highway where a passing truck driver found me. "Jesus, buddy, what happened to you? You look like you've seen a ghost." I told the police everything, of course. They organized search parties, brought in helicopters and tracking dogs. They found the cabin, found evidence of our presence there, but no trace of Marcus, Thomas, or Jonas. The official report blamed their disappearance on getting lost in the wilderness. The strange symbols carved into the trees were dismissed as old Native American markings. The blood message on the cabin wall was explained as a prank by previous visitors. I spent 3 weeks in a psychiatric facility for observation. The doctor said I was suffering from survivor's guilt and acute stress reaction. They gave me medication and therapy and eventually released me back into the world. But I was never the same after that. The forest had marked me, just like the Marcus thing said it would. People could see it in my eyes, in the way I carried myself. I lost my job. My girlfriend left me. My family stopped calling. And I started to notice others like me. People who had the same haunted look, the same careful way of moving through the world. We recognized each other instinctively, survivors of similar experiences in different forests, different dark places. Some of them told me their stories. A group of college friends who went hiking in the Cascades. 5 women on a camping trip in the Adirondacks. A family reunion gone wrong in the deep woods of Maine. The details were different, but the pattern was always the same. Groups of friends or family members. Strange symbols. Mysterious disappearances. One survivor left to tell the tale. And all of us, every single survivor, eventually found ourselves planning new trips. Reaching out to old friends, making new ones, suggesting weekend getaways to remote wilderness areas. We couldn't help ourselves. It wasn't a conscious decision, but something deeper. A compulsion planted in us by our experiences. We were recruiters now, gatherers of new groups for the hungry forests of the world. I've brought 4 different groups to various forests over the past 2 years. Each time, I tell myself I'm just going on a normal camping trip with friends. But deep down, I know the truth. I know what I'm really doing.